The November rain fell like lead against the Camp Livingston fence, each drop a silver needle piercing the Louisiana air. Kurt Schneider pressed his face against the barracks window, watching the endless procession of American trucks rumble past on the muddy road beyond the wire. They came in waves, a mechanical tide of olive drab. Deuce-and-a-halfs, weapons carriers, tankers, ambulances, an unbroken chain stretching toward the horizon. For 3 hours they had rolled by, and still they came. The same thought echoed in the minds of every German prisoner watching from the rain-streaked windows. Where did they end? How many could one nation possibly possess? "Impossible," whispered Otto Reimer, a lieutenant from the Afrika Korps who had fought at El Alamein. "This must be the same convoy circling to intimidate us." But the markings proved otherwise. Different divisions, different cargo, different drivers. Never the same vehicle twice. Kurt had once been proud to serve in what propaganda called the most mechanized army in history. His Panzer Division had swept through France in 1940 with what seemed like unstoppable force. Now he stood imprisoned in America, watching a display of industrial might that made the Wehrmacht's vaunted motorization look like children's toys scattered across a nursery floor. How could he reconcile this reality with everything he'd been told about America? A nation supposedly crippled by depression, weakened by racial mixing, and incapable of discipline. What other lies had been whispered in their ears as they marched east with absolute confidence in their superiority? The thunder of engines continued unabated as darkness fell. The prisoners moved away from the windows, retreating to their bunks, but the rumbling remained, vibrating through the wooden floors, a constant reminder of American production. Kurt lay awake that night, his mind calculating numbers that refused to make sense. In the Afrika Korps, they had cherished every vehicle, cannibalized broken ones to keep others moving. Here, trucks seemed as common as raindrops. A week earlier, one of the American guards had mentioned casually that Camp Livingston alone received deliveries from more than 500 different vehicles each month. 500! Just for one prison camp in the backwoods of Louisiana? Kurt's entire company had fought through the North African campaign with just 23 trucks, and by the end, only 7 remained operational. What would happen to Germany if this mechanical tide turned eastward, carrying with it the full weight of American industrial capacity? The question lingered in the darkness, like a ghost that could not be exorcised by any comforting lie or patriotic memory. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the muddy road still bore the imprint of hundreds of tire tracks, a chaotic pattern stretching beyond the camp gates, like the physical manifestation of a terrible revelation that was only beginning to take shape in the minds of the men behind the wire. The first day of captivity had shocked the German prisoners to their core, though not in ways they had anticipated. Stories circulated among Wehrmacht soldiers that Americans executed prisoners or subjected them to brutal labor. Many had carried poison pills to avoid capture. Some, like Hans Weber, a 24-year-old radio operator from Dresden, had swallowed them in panic as American forces overran their position near St. Lo. The pill proved defective, a final betrayal by a system already collapsing under the weight of shortages and substitutions. Instead of execution, the newly captured Germans experienced a processing system that moved with relentless efficiency. They were registered, deloused, photographed, and examined by medical personnel who spoke briskly but without malice. Most unsettling was the abundance that surrounded even these routine procedures. Fresh bandages for minor wounds, vaccines administered without hesitation, real soap distributed to men who hadn't seen such luxury in years. They waste more medical supplies on prisoners than our field hospitals had for our own wounded, murmured Friedrich Kleinmann, a former medic from Hamburg, as he watched an American doctor casually discard a half-used roll of gauze because it had touched the floor. The men were then loaded onto transportation that defied everything they'd been told to expect. Not crowded boxcars or forced marches, but a convoy of buses and trucks that stretched nearly a kilometer. Each vehicle was newer, cleaner, and better maintained than anything they had seen in the past 3 years of war. The seats were padded, the engines purred rather than coughed. No smoke belched from exhausted pistons. No drivers cursed as they cranked reluctant starters. Kurt Schneider, who had served as a mechanic before being pressed into infantry service, stared out the window as they drove through Mississippi toward Louisiana, counting the military vehicles they passed on the highways. 217 in a single day's journey, more trucks than his entire regiment had possessed. "This is just one road in one small part of America," he said quietly to Otto. "Imagine what moves across the entire country." Meals came regularly during transport. Sandwiches on white bread so soft it seemed unreal, apples without blemish, coffee that tasted of actual beans rather than the acorn substitute they'd grown accustomed to in Germany. When one prisoner hesitated, suspicious of poison, the American guard laughed. "Why would we waste food poisoning you fellas when we've got more important things to do? Eat up or don't, makes no difference to us." That casual indifference to waste struck deeper than any cruelty. In Germany, each crumb was precious. Here, uneaten sandwiches were tossed into garbage cans without a second thought. The implications hung in the air, unspoken but understood. A nation that could discard food so easily was not one struggling to supply its war machine. Upon arrival at Camp Livingston, the most disorienting sight awaited them. Beyond the expected guard towers and barbed wire stood row upon row of trucks. Not just military vehicles, but civilian models converted for camp use. Delivery trucks bearing the logos of Coca-Cola, bread companies, laundry services, and countless other businesses rolled through the gates hourly. America, it seemed, had enough vehicles not just for its military needs, but to maintain the peacetime rhythms of commerce even in the midst of global conflict. When night fell on that first day, Kurt lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, his worldview crumbling faster than the Wehrmacht's Eastern Front. The deception wasn't just in what they'd been told about American weakness, but in what they'd been led to believe about German strength. If America had this many trucks just to maintain a prison camp in Louisiana, how could the Reich possibly stand against such production when it arrived in full force on the battlefields of Europe? The barracks fell silent, except for the distant rumble of engines, a sound that would soon become as constant as their own heartbeats, and just as impossible to ignore. The daily routine of camp life brought fresh revelations with each passing hour. Mornings began with the arrival of the breakfast convoy. Not a single truck bearing meager rations, but a procession of vehicles carrying milk, eggs, bread, and other supplies that would have been unimaginable luxuries in wartime Germany. Kurt found himself assigned to the unloading detail, where he stood alongside fellow prisoners, passing crates from hand to hand, each one heavy with abundance. "Back home, my mother waits 4 hours for one egg," said Dieter Hoffmann, a young infantryman from Munich, as he stared at a crate containing 30 dozen. "Here, they feed them to prisoners as if they were water." The American quartermaster, a stocky sergeant from Chicago named Williams, overheard the comment and shrugged. "Food's not the problem. Transport is. Getting it to the right places at the right time, that's the trick." He gestured toward the line of trucks. "That's why we've got these babies, built more in the last 2 years than in the 20 years before that." Kurt translated for those who didn't understand English, watching their expressions shift from disbelief to a quiet, disturbing acceptance. The Reich had told them America was soft, undisciplined, incapable of the focused production that Germany's superior organization made possible. Yet here was evidence to the contrary that could not be dismissed as propaganda. Most telling was the age of the vehicles. In the Wehrmacht, trucks were repaired until they simply could not move another meter, then cannibalized for parts to keep others running. Many had been manufactured before Hitler took power. But these American machines gleamed with newness. Serial numbers checked surreptitiously by Kurt and other prisoners revealed manufacturing dates from 1942, 43, even early 44. They were not leftovers from peacetime production, but the fruits of an industrial capacity that had awakened with terrifying speed once America entered the war. The camp itself sprawled across the Louisiana landscape, a small city behind wire. To move supplies from one section to another required internal transport, More trucks, jeeps, and small utility vehicles darting along dirt roads from warehouses to kitchens, from medical facilities to barracks areas. Kurt estimated that Camp Livingston alone operated more vehicles than his hometown of Heidelberg had possessed before the war. One afternoon, as rain turned the paths to mud, Kurt felt the ground vibrate beneath his boots. Around the bend came a massive bulldozer, pushing effortlessly through the mire to clear a drainage channel. Behind it followed 2 graders and a convoy of dump trucks, each loaded with gravel, for a muddy path. In a prisoner of war camp. In Russia, we carried stones by hand to make roads, whispered Hans Weber. 20 men died in my company from exhaustion, doing work these Americans assigned to machines. The bulldozer's metal treads left deep impressions in the Louisiana clay, but they cut even deeper into the prisoner's certainties. The sound of its engine, powerful, unstrained, seemed to mock the desperate struggles of the Eastern Front, where German soldiers hitched themselves to artillery pieces like draft animals when horses could not be found. That night, as the prisoners huddled in small groups, the conversation turned again to the mechanical abundance surrounding them. Questions previously unthinkable now formed on reluctant lips. If America devoted this much motorized transport to a prisoner camp in Louisiana, what force was gathering in England for the invasion of Europe? If vehicles were so plentiful that they could be spared for the most mundane tasks, what did that mean for the future of a Reich already struggling to replace losses on multiple fronts? No one spoke the ultimate question aloud, but it hung in the air like the smoke from their American cigarettes. Had they sacrificed everything? Comfort, morality, humanity, for a cause already doomed by the simple mathematics of industrial production. Outside the barracks window, the lights of yet another convoy flickered through the trees, each headlamp illuminating not just the road ahead, but the growing darkness of doubt. "I was a driver for Field Marshal Rommel," said Werner Klug, his weathered face tight with suppressed emotion as he sat at the edge of his bunk. The former Afrika Korps sergeant spoke quietly, but the barracks had fallen silent to hear him. "My vehicle was hit during the retreat from El Alamein. We had no replacement. Do you know what happened next? Rommel himself gave up his command car so our artillery observer could continue. The Desert Fox, traveling like a foot soldier because we couldn't spare another vehicle." He paused, passing a trembling hand over his face before continuing. "Yesterday, I watched the Americans replace a truck because its radio had a static problem. Not the engine, the radio. They took the supplies off, transferred them to a new truck, and drove away. The old one went to their motor pool for a minor repair." Similar stories emerged from other corners of the barracks. Heinrich Brandt, a tank commander captured in Normandy, described how his unit had been forced to abandon functional Panther tanks not because they were damaged, but because fuel shortages made it impossible to withdraw them from the advancing Allies. "We were told it was temporary," he said, bitterness edging his voice. "That new production would replace our losses tenfold. Yet here I stand in America, watching trucks roll by that outnumber our entire Panzer Reserve." Stefan Ruhl, once a supply officer for the 6th Army, sat with his back against the wall, eyes fixed on some distant memory. "In Stalingrad, we slaughtered the last horses for food in January. By February, we were pulling artillery by hand through snow up to our waists." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I see these Americans drive a jeep 200 meters rather than walk." They have no concept of scarcity. The stories continued into the night, each one a thread in a tapestry of realization. What emerged was not simply astonishment at American abundance, but a dawning recognition of how thoroughly they had been deceived about Germany's own capabilities. Kurt remembered broadcasts by Goebbels describing miraculous new production techniques that would flood the front with vehicles. He had believed them because he wanted to believe, because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. Now, watching the endless stream of American transport, those broadcasts seemed like fairy tales told to soothe frightened children. The most devastating insights came from prisoners who had worked in German factories before the war. Manfred Kohler had been an engineer at Opel before being drafted in 1941. Our best assembly methods still required 16 hours per truck chassis, he explained, sketching production diagrams in the dirt floor with a stick. The Americans have reduced it to under 4 hours through true mass production. We spoke of assembly lines, but we never fully implemented them. Too much pride in craftsmanship, too little urgency. He paused, letting the implications sink in. It's not just quantity. Their standardization means parts are interchangeable between most models. Our vehicles, each manufacturer had different specifications, different parts. A broken Mercedes couldn't be repaired with Opel components. The Americans, it seemed, had approached war production not as a matter of national pride or tradition, but as a mathematical problem to be solved with ruthless efficiency. The result moved beyond the barbed wire of Camp Livingston in an endless river of vehicles, each one identical to thousands of others, each one a mobile testament to the unstoppable force of American industry. Even the guards, when asked, seemed puzzled by the prisoners' fascination with what they considered ordinary logistics. "Hell, this is nothing," said Corporal Morris, a guard from Detroit who had worked at the Ford River Rouge plant before the war. "You should see the factory I came from. We were pushing out a new truck every 63 minutes, 24 hours a day. And that was just one line in one factory." He spoke without boasting, simply stating facts that seemed impossible to the German prisoners. A truck every 63 minutes? 24 hours a day? From just one assembly line? Kurt translated the guards' words for the others, watching their faces. Some refused to believe, calling it obvious propaganda. Others simply stared at the ground, unwilling to engage with a reality that undermined everything they had fought for. That night, the sound of engines continued unabated. Kurt lay awake, his mind filled not with the machinery itself, but with the human cost of believing in Germany's supremacy. How many lives had been sacrificed to maintain a delusion that was now crumbling beneath the wheels of endless American trucks? The human dimension of America's vehicular superiority emerged gradually, revealing itself in unexpected moments. One rainy afternoon, Kurt and several other prisoners watched as a driver maneuvered his truck through the muddy camp roads, got stuck briefly, and then engaged a secondary drive system that propelled the vehicle forward with little effort. "Four-wheel drive," explained Corporal Morris, noticing their interest. "Most of our trucks have it. Doesn't matter much on good roads, but out here in the mud, it's the difference between moving and sitting." Kurt nodded slowly, remembering the Wehrmacht's constant struggles with terrain. So many times he had seen German trucks and even tanks immobilized by mud or snow, unable to progress without teams of men pushing or laying brushwood beneath the wheels. "In Russia," he said hesitantly, "we lost more than 80% of our transport during the first winter. The cold froze engines, and the mud swallowed vehicles whole." Morris nodded without surprise. "Our trucks are winterized standard now. Block heaters, special lubricants, sealed electrical systems. Learned that from the Canadians." The casual mention of standardized winterization, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, struck Kurt like a physical blow. The Wehrmacht had entered Russia with vehicles designed for Western European conditions, their cooling systems optimized for summer heat rather than winter cold. The results had been catastrophic. Heinrich Brandt joined the conversation, his face tight with suppressed emotion. "You know what we did when vehicles broke down in the field? We shot the horses to feed the men, then burned the wagons for warmth." Morris said nothing, but his expression shifted subtly. For perhaps the first time, he was seeing not enemy soldiers, but men who had suffered under the weight of strategic miscalculation. The conversation turned to drivers. In the Wehrmacht, driving a truck was considered a specialized skill, with drivers receiving specific training and classification. Here, it seemed almost everyone could operate the vehicles. "Back home, my village had 3 automobiles before the war," said Hans Weber. "Here, your cooks drive trucks to deliver meals. Your medical orderlies drive ambulances. Even the chaplain has his own Jeep." Morris laughed. "Hell, I learned to drive when I was 14 on my daddy's farm. Most Americans can handle a vehicle by the time they're old enough to shave." The implications were stunning.
The American military did not need to train drivers from scratch or carefully husband a limited pool of skilled operators. They drew from a civilian population already mechanized, already familiar with engines and transmissions and fuel systems. It was one more advantage that had never appeared in Wehrmacht intelligence assessments but proved decisive in practice. Even the relationships between men and machines revealed cultural differences that went beyond mere numbers. Kurt noticed how American drivers treated their vehicles, with a casual competence born of familiarity, but also with a certain possessiveness. They named them, painted personal symbols on them, modified them in small ways to improve comfort or efficiency. "This here's Betsy," said a young driver from Texas, patting the hood of his truck. "Got me through the worst roads in Tennessee during training, and now she works just as good in this Louisiana mud." For the Germans, vehicles had always been military property, treated with appropriate respect, but never personalized.
The American approach, treating machines almost as companions, seemed oddly sentimental, yet produced tangible results. Drivers who named their trucks also maintained them more carefully, noticed problems earlier, and operated them more skillfully. What emerged was a picture not just of industrial superiority, but of a fundamentally different relationship with technology. Americans seemed to exist in natural harmony with their machines, an extension of a society built around mobility and mechanical power. Germans, despite their technical education, approached vehicles as specialized tools requiring expert handling. "They don't just have more trucks," Kurt explained to his fellow prisoners after weeks of observation. "They understand them differently. For us, motorization was a military program imposed from above. For them, it's a way of life." This revelation sparked quiet conversations throughout the camp. Men who had devoted years to the war effort, who had believed in Germany's destiny as the most advanced nation on earth, now confronted evidence that they had fundamentally misunderstood not just America's productive capacity, but its entire relationship with technology. The motor pool revelation came on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, when Kurt and 5 other prisoners were assigned to help unload supplies at the camp's central warehouse. The autumn air carried a hint of coolness that reminded the Germans of home, making the scene before them even more disorienting. Behind the warehouse stretched a gravel lot filled with vehicles, not the active transport that continually moved through the camp, but rows of trucks parked in neat lines, apparently unused. Kurt counted silently as they walked past, 20 in the first row, 18 in the second, 22 in the third. More than 100 vehicles sitting idle at a single prisoner of war camp.
"What are all these for?" he asked the American sergeant supervising their work detail, trying to keep his voice casual. The sergeant, Patterson was his name, a square-jawed man from Pennsylvania, glanced at the lot without particular interest. "Reserve pool, in case we need extras or when the active vehicles go in for maintenance." "All these? Just waiting?" Kurt struggled to keep the disbelief from his voice. Patterson nodded. "SOP, standard operating procedure. Every installation maintains at least a 20% reserve capacity. Helps prevent bottlenecks if there's an emergency." 20% reserve! The words echoed in Kurt's mind as he mechanically unloaded crates from the waiting truck. In the final months before his capture, his unit had operated at less than 50% of its authorized vehicle strength, with no reserves whatsoever. Every functional transport had been pressed into constant service, running until it broke down completely. That evening, he shared what he had seen with the other prisoners. At first, many refused to believe him. "Impossible," said Otto Reimer. "No army maintains reserves at that level. The waste would be unacceptable." "It's not waste to them," Kurt replied quietly. "It's insurance. They value predictability over maximum efficiency." This concept that abundance could enable a different approach to logistics was perhaps the most profound realization of all. The American system was not built around extracting the last possible kilometer from each vehicle, but around ensuring that transportation would always be available when needed. They sacrificed theoretical efficiency for practical reliability. Werner Klug, who had served as Rommel's driver, sat heavily on his bunk. Do you know how many times we missed opportunities because vehicles failed at critical moments?
The Lane might have ended differently if we'd had reliable transport for ammunition and fuel. The conversation turned, as it increasingly did, to the implications for Germany. If the American reserve pool at Camp Livingston alone exceeded the transport capability of a Wehrmacht regiment, what did that say about the relative strength of the two forces? How could Germany possibly continue to fight against such overwhelming material superiority? It was never about the number of trucks, said Manfred Kohler, the former Opel engineer. It was about the capacity to produce them faster than they could be destroyed. His words cut through the barracks like a knife. Germany had entered the war believing in its industrial and technological edge, only to discover that America could outproduce not just Germany, but all of Europe combined.
The trucks sitting unused behind the warehouse represented not just vehicles, but an entire philosophy of war that Germany had failed to comprehend until it was too late. Later that week, Kurt witnessed a scene that crystallized this understanding. A convoy of new trucks arrived at the camp, their olive-drab paint still factory fresh. As they were unloaded, he noticed workers removing certain parts, distributors, carburetors, fuel pumps, and replacing them with slightly different components. "Why change parts on new vehicles?" he asked Corporal Morris, who was overseeing the process. "Modifications based on field reports," Morris explained. "The factories are still working from slightly older designs. When we get feedback from the front, we update vehicles before deploying them." This ongoing evolution, the constant refinement of designs based on practical experience, represented another dimension of American industrial superiority.
The Germans had produced remarkable vehicles, but in relatively small numbers and with limited ability to incorporate lessons from the field. The American system seemed capable of both massive production and continuous improvement, a combination that left Kurt staring at the trucks with a mixture of professional admiration and personal despair. What future remained for a Germany whose enemies could not only outproduce them by orders of magnitude, but could also adapt and improve more quickly? The question had no comforting answer. As autumn deepened toward winter, the mood in the camp darkened with it. News filtered in through new prisoners and officially permitted newspapers. The Allied advance across France, the Soviet push from the east, the bombing of German cities. For men who had once believed victory was inevitable, these reports might once have been dismissed as propaganda. Now, having witnessed American industrial might firsthand, they carried the unmistakable weight of truth. "We are not losing because our soldiers lack courage," said Heinrich Brandt one evening as a group gathered in the barracks. "We are losing because we aimed a rifle at an enemy who had built a cannon." The metaphor resonated. Germany had prepared for a different kind of war, one where tactical brilliance and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. But modern warfare had evolved beyond that calculation. The endless stream of trucks beyond the camp fence testified to a reality where industrial capacity trumped individual heroism. "What happens to Germany now?" asked Hans Weber, the young radio operator, "when all these vehicles carry American troops into our homeland?" No one answered. The question was too painful, the future too clear to those who had seen with their own eyes what America could produce when fully mobilized for war. Kurt found himself thinking of his family in Heidelberg, his mother, his younger sister, his aging grandfather. What would they face as this mechanical pied rolled eastward across a Germany already stripped of resources by years of total war? The trucks that delivered abundance to American prison camps would soon be carrying different cargo to a defeated Reich. The most difficult realization was not about the war itself, but about the society that had sent them to fight it. Germany had presented itself as the pinnacle of modernity, efficiency, and technical prowess. The evidence before them suggested otherwise, that in the race for true industrial modernity, Germany had fallen fatally behind while believing itself ahead. "We were not defeated by America," Kurt said softly. "We were defeated by our own illusions." Outside, the engines continued their constant rhythm, a mechanical requiem for dreams of empire that had already begun to fade.
The moment of personal truth came for Kurt on a cold December morning when he was assigned to help in the camp's vehicle maintenance facility. The work was familiar, checking oil levels, testing batteries, inspecting tires, yet performed under conditions that made his previous experience seem primitive by comparison. The American maintenance bay was heated, brightly lit, and equipped with pneumatic tools that made heavy tasks effortless. Diagnostic equipment could pinpoint electrical problems in minutes that might have taken German mechanics hours to locate. Most striking was the attitude toward parts replacement. "If it's worn at all, we swap it," explained the chief mechanic, a sergeant from Michigan who had worked for General Motors before the war. "No point waiting for failure when prevention costs less in the long run." This philosophy, replacing components before they failed, represented a level of material confidence Kurt had never encountered.
In the Wehrmacht, parts were used until they broke completely, then repaired rather than replaced whenever possible. The concept of preventive maintenance existed in theory, but rarely in practice. While checking a row of staff cars, Kurt came upon a vehicle with license plates from Wisconsin. Inside the glove compartment, he found a maintenance log with entries dating back to 1941, the car's entire service history documented in meticulous detail. Oil changes every 3,000 miles, tire rotations, brake inspections, scheduled component replacements. He stared at the log, a lump forming in his throat. This single American staff car, assigned to a captain responsible for prisoner transfers, had received more consistent maintenance than the command vehicles of Wehrmacht generals. It was not a special case, not a showcase example, but simply standard procedure in a system built on abundance rather than scarcity. That evening, sitting on his bunk with the day's images still fresh in his mind, Kurt made a decision that would have been unthinkable months earlier. He approached the camp's educational officer, an American lieutenant who organized voluntary classes for prisoners, and requested permission to study American automotive engineering and production methods. "I want to understand," he said simply. "When Germany rebuilds, we will need to learn these lessons." The admission that Germany would need to rebuild, that defeat was not just possible but inevitable, marked a profound shift. Kurt was no longer a temporary captive awaiting liberation by victorious German forces. He had become a student of the system that had defeated his homeland, preparing for a future beyond war. As spring brought new growth to the Louisiana landscape in 1945, a surprising visitor arrived, a civilian engineer from the War Production Board conducting a study on transport efficiency. He requested permission to interview some of the German prisoners with automotive experience, and Kurt found himself part of a small group meeting with the American in the camp's administration building. The man, a Dr. Ellison from Washington, wore a rumpled suit and spoke with the direct manner of someone accustomed to dealing with technical rather than political questions. He asked about German vehicle designs, maintenance procedures, and fuel consumption rates, with professional interest rather than triumphalism. "What most limited your transport capabilities?" he asked, pencil poised over a notebook. The prisoners exchanged glances before Kurt answered. "Not design, but production capacity. And fuel. Always fuel." Dr. Ellison nodded. "Interesting. Our studies suggested the same." He leaned forward slightly. "I'll be frank, gentlemen. We're already planning for the post-war rebuilding of Europe." "Your experience has value for that planning." The statement stunned the prisoners into silence. The concept that Americans were already planning for reconstruction while bombs still fell on German cities struck the prisoners as both arrogant and strangely hopeful. "Do you know how many trucks the United States has produced since Pearl Harbor?" Dr. Ellison asked, glancing down at his notes. None of the prisoners ventured a guess. 2,400,000 as of last month, he said matter-of-factly. And that's just trucks, not tanks, not jeeps, not other military vehicles. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. 2,400,000, more than the entire complement of the Wehrmacht at its peak strength. More vehicles than Germany had produced in the decade before the war. And this was just one category of American production. News of Hitler's death reached Camp Livingston on May 1, 1945, followed a week later by Germany's unconditional surrender.
For Kurt and his circle, these announcements merely confirmed what they had already accepted through witnessing American industrial might firsthand. The end had been visible in every convoy that passed their camp. In August 1945, as the war with Japan ended, Kurt received unexpected news. He had been selected for early repatriation as part of a program returning prisoners with technical skills needed for rebuilding. On his final evening in Camp Livingston, Kurt stood by the fence one last time, watching the vehicles move along the perimeter road. Their endless procession had once symbolized defeat. Now they represented something else, a lesson learned, a reality accepted, a future possible. Corporal Morris approached him at the fence. "Heading home tomorrow, I hear?" Kurt nodded. "What's left of home." Morris was silent for a moment, then said, "You know, my daddy builds cars in Detroit. Been doing it for 30 years. He always said the Germans made better machines, just not enough of them." The next morning, Kurt boarded a truck that would take him to a processing center for repatriation. As the convoy pulled away, he looked back at the place where his understanding of the world had been fundamentally transformed. The lessons learned behind those barriers would travel back to Germany in the minds of men like Kurt. Lessons not just about trucks and production methods, but about the dangers of believing your own propaganda when reality tells a different story.
In the years to come, when visitors to Germany marveled at its economic recovery, few would recognize the role played by men like Kurt Schneider, who had watched American trucks roll past a Louisiana prison camp and understood what they truly represented. Not just military power, but an industrial philosophy that would help transform a shattered nation into a new economic force. For these former prisoners, the endless convoy of American vehicles had delivered not just defeat, but the first shipment of a different future.